Hello and welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. I'm Craig DL, I'm the Head of Policy and Research at Common Weal. My usual co-host, Jonathan Shaffey, is not here today because today I'm very pleased to say that we have a special guest on the podcast. I would like to introduce you to Colin Turbett, a member of our social care reform group who has just written a paper for us on reform of social work in Scotland that will be coming out very, very soon. So we thought we'd get him on the podcast this week to talk a bit about that paper. And Colin, hello. Now you're a formal social worker. You're now a writer on social work issues. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about your bio and your experience and what you've done?
Sure, I'm absolutely delighted. It's good to be here. I came into local authority social work in 1974, which is quite a long time ago now, and I qualified as a social worker in 1978 and practiced in social work in the front line as both a social worker and latterly a children and family team manager, all in the west of Scotland from then until 2015 when I formally retired. By the time I retired, I was already writing and commenting on social work, particularly from a critical and radical standpoint, and also had a particular interest in rural social work. I worked for quite a long time on the Isle of Arran, but latterly I worked in an urban area, so that's really my interest. I started writing before I retired and had stuff published, peer-reviewed papers and a couple of books, and I've continued that, and I'm still very much involved in consulting and talking to people about social work issues.
See, that's precisely how I ended up getting dragged into the world of politics. I started writing, people started reading what I was saying, and it kind of exploded from there. Now, you're involved in our social care reform group. This was a working group we Common Weal set up just towards the tail end of last year, really with a purpose of engaging with the Feely Review, which is the Scottish Government's consultation on care review. Can you tell us a bit about that, your experience working there, and what you feel about the Feely Review as it's come out?
Okay, I became involved in the group. I was connected with the group through Unison, a trade union which I remain very much involved with and help them whenever I can in stuff in relation to social work issues in Scotland and indeed nationally, if I get the opportunity, and was really happy to join the group. I certainly had an admiration for Nick Kemp, who leads the group, who's produced a really good critique of the social care service and the problems through the pandemic that led to the commissioning of the Feely Review by Scottish Government in earlier last year as a response to deaths in care homes. Nick had written a very, very good critique of that, and I was delighted to join the group. The Feely Review, which we didn't get sight of until fairly late on, until it was published. We didn't manage to speak to Feely within the group, although we had fed him stuff. It's a bit of a disappointment all round. I think the headline that we would be provided with a national care service has been, it's a promise that's not been met. It's not a national care service, it's a restructuring of present services and the way they're arranged, and really taking things in the same kind of direction of travel that we've been moving in for several years now, consolidating structures that really are not working. And that's at the nub of our critique from the Care Reform Working Group, that we needed fundamental change, we needed public ownership, we needed more than just the promise, and it is still just a promise of better pay and conditions for the most worst treated staff in the social care sector, those who work for private enterprises and the third sector. It should be much more than just about improving things for them, and at the same time for some of the people who they look after, and by and large look after very well, despite everything.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really kind of popped out to me, and the government, the way the government talked about the Feely review and their response to it was they made it very clear that they were not enthusiastic about nationalising care, which then sort of just brings up the question: what is a national care service if it's not nationally owned?
Yeah, yeah. It should be more than just a label. I mean, I think everybody knows and loves the NHS, and to just call something national and expect people to treat it with the same reverence and respect just ain't going to work if things are not changed fundamentally. That the establishment of the NHS in 1948 was really predicated by a revolution in healthcare that took things, or much of the service, not GP services locally, but much of the service out with private hands, and made it free at the point of need for everyone. And that remains little more than an aspiration within the National Care Service that Feely's proposing. And even the promised improvements for staff are, according to yesterday's budget, there's no funding for them. So we await word on how even those promises will be met.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly the leaves fall off the magic money tree as soon as you're asked to actually do something useful with it. Now, the Care Reform Group, in their response to Feely, have produced a manifesto of principles for care reform, and I'll link to that in the description below the podcast. And this is leading up to a larger body of work from the group on essentially taking those principles and designing a national care service that meets those principles, and that gives us an idea of really what to aim for. Now, as part of that, the group has been producing a lot of original work, and this is where your paper comes in, the paper that's going to be coming out, Struggling to Care, looking specifically at social workers. Now, this was something that was almost completely absent from Feely, is that right?
It's interesting because Feely makes reference to social workers, and also he makes reference to things that social workers should be doing, which is preventative work, advocacy, working with people through relationship-based practice. That's all things that social workers train for. But Feely unfortunately doesn't link them to what he sees social workers as doing in the future. In fact, he makes very little comment at all and puts it off to another day and other reviews that may or may not be in the pipeline. And that could well be a massive missed opportunity. Feely's not the only major review that's come out in the last year or so. A year ago, just over a year ago, we had the report of the Independent Care Review into childcare, which looked at how, well, that was based on historical disaster experienced by young people in the care system and children, and the abuse they suffered and the terrible practice that lay behind the way that they were often treated. The promise which came out of that, which is now being worked out, the promise now have a governing board and staff, and are beginning to look at how they might implement that. What social workers do will be central to that. Fiona Duncan, who leads the review, hasn't really paid much attention to the resource implications of that. But that could any kind of sensible look at change would link the promise with the independent care review of an adults, the Feely review, join the two together to look at why and how social work could and should be reformed. And that's really what our paper tries to address. It's a huge gap in the Feely review, and we've looked at that very seriously and talked to a lot of people to work up some of the ideas we've got.
So this is a kind of common issue I see in other areas of policy, where you look at a problem and you immediately think this is too big. Can we maybe just break it down into smaller chunks? So with Feely, you might think about things like home care, care homes, childcare, social work, all as different silos. Is that a way of just making the problem more manageable when you're coming up with solutions, or do you think that you really do need to look at how all these services interlink?
Yeah, no, it's a recipe for making things worse, not better. Social work's been failing for many years now. The rot set in, and I've been was a social worker for so long now that I can trace the changes. When I came into social work back in the 1970s, although it wasn't perfect and it was grossly under-resourced, nonetheless, we were able to work with individuals, to work with families in a preventative way to help them not fall off the edge. Nowadays, services are targeted at people who've already fallen over the cliff. So social workers wait at the bottom to mop up the mess. And that's true of both children and family work, all the different areas of adult work, and right across the board. And here was an opportunity to address that and do something about it, to bring social work back to what social workers want and trained to do and what they could do and have the potential to do, but which we've lost sight of since the 1990s. And we know why that is. There were neoliberalism, and the marketplace crept into social work back then. Social work was criticised heavily for getting it wrong in some celebrated, notorious child care cases where children died. Social workers were unreasonably made responsible for that, or made to feel responsible for that. So their work changed gradually and then at a galloping pace into something that was very procedurally driven from the top down and very narrow in its outlook. So nowadays, social workers are in local authorities, and there are about 11,000 in Scotland, so we're talking about quite a considerable workforce, are siloed into services that offer public protection functions, child protection, adult protection, types of interventions for people with chronic mental health problems, acute mental health problems, and acting as gatekeepers for social care. Now, those are all aspects of social work that are arguably very important and won't go away. But they're certainly a small part of social work's potential to help communities and help individuals at the very root of social problems. And last year there was a big hullabaloo about Scotland's appalling death rate for people that suffer addiction issues, heroin and cocaine and the rest of it. And what you didn't hear in that debate or that outcry was any mention of social work. And these are things that social workers used to do. Another example that we cite in the paper is of the response to COVID-19, where community hubs have been set up all over the country, fantastic work being done, but most of it by volunteers. And the potential for trained social workers to have been involved in helping develop community resilience and a community response was entirely lost or just overlooked.
Just
So
absent
social work
altogether.
isn't mentioned at all.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely absent, and that wasn't the case in other countries.
yeah, this was something that I actually arrived on completely independently. I'm not claiming any great genius on this. I've not got any kind of background in social care myself, but just from observing the practices in other countries, and also the experience in my own location when the pandemic hit and we did see those volunteer groups come together. My village formed, a resilience group that has been doing a remarkable work looking after people, making sure that everyone has food in the house when they can't get out to go shopping, and making sure everyone's okay, just doing general well-being calls as well. And this was an experience that I drew into my initial paper on the pandemic response almost a year ago now. I really kind of wanted Scotland to already have those community-based groups in place, probably doing other kind of social care functions, but when an emergency strikes, they can be re-geared into performing this kind of resilience work. So that was just based on my observations of what was going on elsewhere. But when folk like yourself come up and say that this is an idea that really should be there, it was something that got my attention.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. I'm just amazed. I'm horrified actually at how social work just hasn't been in the frame at all. And I don't think that would have been the case 20, 30 years ago. I think social work would have been at the centre because it enjoyed a greater respect and profile and presence within local communities, and it's all been lost.
Do you
So
think
the
this is
social work is,
because social work has been put into this post-interventionist role where you almost get
yeah,
a stigmatization of the work? There, if you quote unquote need a social worker, then you have already fallen through the cracks.
yeah,
Whereas, and also if as a community you see someone, some the social worker coming into the community, it's because a problem has already happened.
yeah.
You're right.
That's absolutely the case, Craig. Absolutely the case. Yeah,
So
and it doesn't have to be like that. And sadly, a lot of social workers themselves think that that's all they should be doing. And those that work in adult care, the ones that Feely's talking about, regard themselves as care managers,
mm,
and might only see themselves as social workers, the job they're trained to do, as a kind of secondary title. And that's a tragedy because all that potential has been lost. I mean, social workers could act as key community activists because of the investment that's made in them, and that investment's never realised. In fact, if you look at it from a kind of cost efficiency point of view, to only locate the people that you invest in to help cure social problems or help people sort them out, to only locate them so far downstream that things are already so far broken that you can't repair them again, it's just crazy. So it means that more children come into the care system at huge expense. More older people need residential and nursing home care rather than the potential to possibly help them retain some independence at home is lost because you're not putting in the services at a more preventative level. And Feely talks about this, but he doesn't demonstrate in any way at all how it could be addressed.
yeah, so if we imagine a hypothetical community, what would that preventative community-based
Mm.
group actually look like?
Well, we've got some good ideas about that we discuss in the Struggling for Care paper, and that's that social work needs to move out of the kind of centralised silos, and that's literally what they are. Huge, great offices in the centre of town, um, where hundreds of staff in them who go out to the schemes and the places where people actually live to deliver a service. Move them out of these places and back into communities. Um, Back into GP surgeries or schools or wherever. And it doesn't even have to be in particular office buildings. They're just out where people are, where networks come together, where other key people in the communities like teachers and health workers are located. Move them back out there so they're able to engage with people and network with people and groups at a very, very early stage in the process, not even possibly social workers, but just as people helping bring folk together to resolve common issues. And so that we call that community
Hmm.
social work. So that's the rallying cry. Take social work back to communities and let's talk about community-based social work.
I'm going to ask a potentially controversial question on this. How would this fit? Would this fit into something like the very controversial named person scheme, where everyone has an identified um, person that they go
Mm.
to, or would this be more of a okay, you just have an identified place to go to?
Yeah, I mean, named person was very controversial, and I had a view on that I expressed in a Common Weal article some years ago and got a bit of stick for it actually because it went against other opinion on the left, which saw the named person as quite a kind of sinister intrusion into people's lives. Big Brother's watching you. I didn't see it like that. I saw in my social work career people, young women in particular, because I worked in a children and family team. So these often I saw very young mothers who'd had no opportunities themselves in life, who became pregnant at a very young age, were totally ill-equipped and unable, and had no family support to look after their babies. And we had to become involved in order to provide alternative care. And it was a tragedy. It made my heart sink every time we got involved in a situation like that. And a named person idea could have identified those children, those young people, much earlier in childhood and got them the help and support they needed in order that those outcomes were avoided. And I can't do it for reasons of confidentiality,
Mm-hmm.
but I could cite cases where that's absolutely what happened. The quiet child who sat at the back of the classroom didn't draw attention to themselves through poor behaviour or for any other reason, was ignored by teachers, was ignored by everybody, and then nobody knew what was going on at home and how awful a life that child was leading. And a named person or an intervention, some scrutiny at a much, much earlier stage could actually have helped address that. I know that's not a view that many of my colleagues share, but it's certainly a view that I strongly hold through experience.
Well, if anyone wants to come in with another view on this, please do get in touch with the
Yeah,
podcast, and we can get a conversation
absolutely.
going on that.
I mean, named
But
person's been dumped anyway.
yeah,
There were all sorts of issues, some of quite legitimate issues connected with it. But I think the general idea of somebody being responsible for overseeing the welfare of a child from a very early stage was a sound one.
so back to your paper and on social work and especially on the community-based preventative approach. How do you see this fitting into a broader national care service, and do you think we can get there from where the Feely Review's proposals are now?
Well, the answer to that is no, because Feely doesn't even look at it. Never, and Feely, in fact, wants to restructure social work in quite a negative way by taking social workers, possibly, I mean, this is the implication of the review, taking social workers out of the employ of local authorities, where at least the service enjoys some democratic accountability through councillors, and locating them within integrated joint boards, who are answerable only to a junior minister in government. That's not going to take us anywhere. What that would lead to more emphasis on things like for adult workers in adult social care, social workers, on freeing up beds in hospitals. I mean, there aren't enough beds in hospitals anyway. We know that. COVID-19 has shown that. But at the moment, because one of the things that's happened in social work is integration with health, which is another trend that's been underway for a number of years now that nobody in government seriously questioned, I think wrongly. But social work's been totally assimilated by health. So concerns are not about the roots of poverty and inequality and injustice, but concerns are about freeing up beds in hospitals, and that is policies around that drive integration and drive the way social workers are expected to work. So Feely questions none of that process.
It also tends to drive that again, just that slide into a post-interventionist approach. You wait
Yes,
until someone arrives at the bed and then you try to get them off it as quickly as possible, rather than trying to make sure
absolutely.
they don't get
Yeah,
anywhere near there.
yeah.
So so if we do need a national care service and Feely is not up to scratch, what's the step for the Scottish Government?
Well, hopefully after the new Parliament's elected in May, there will be a thorough, good-going debate in Parliament about what's needed and how it could be delivered, and what what groups like our social care reform working group need to do is to ensure that our voice is heard in there, alongside that of trade unions and relatives groups and so on, so that the government are forced to consider not just the Feely proposals, but to look at a vision beyond that, to create a service that we can really be proud of and which connects with the needs of communities and not just the needs of people that manage hospital beds.
I have to say that even though social care isn't really my area, I have really enjoyed being a part of the reform group and the conversations around that, and seeing that work develop, and the stuff I've learned just from listening in at the weekly meetings has been really enlightening. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the final care blueprint when it's ready and we're ready to publish that. And I do hope I can maybe get you or and perhaps Nick and maybe some of the others from the group onto the podcast to talk about it when it's ready.
Yeah, absolutely right, Craig. It's a fantastic, vibrant group with representing a great deal of experience and enthusiasm to make things better. And I think the group we've all complemented one another in that respect. So it's great, and it's a huge amount of work, and weekly meetings for an hour and a half, and then lots of work going in between them. It's been no small piece of work, and I've been really pleased to have been a part of it latterly.
Yeah, I mean, this is now the second research working group that Common Weal has set up. The first one being our group on energy. We drew experts on renewable energy from all over Scotland, and the work that they've done has been amazing as well. It's really turning into quite a good model for us for producing this really world class policy development. I once made a joke to the energy group saying that the work they were doing, really they could very easily spin out into their own independent think tank, to which they responded, "Oh, we've thought about that, but we really like the Common Weal brand." So, Colin, thank you for coming onto the show and talking to us.
It's been good.
I'll look forward to continuing to engage with the group, and I will keep everyone out there abreast of what you're all doing. Just to finally say to our audience, the Common Weal as an organisation, we are entirely dependent on folk like yourselves giving us a small regular donations of something like a fiver or a tenner a week. This is how that we can produce this work, how we can coordinate all these researchers and help them to publish their work through us. So if you find value in what we're doing and you enjoy the work that we're doing, please, if you can support us, please do so. All of our policy papers are available for free to download on the Policy Library, and I would also encourage you, if there's anything in there that you want to see happen in Scotland, please take that policy, send it to your representative, send it to your MSP, send it to your MP, and demand as a constituent that they do that for you. So once again, Colin, thank you, and everyone out there, I'll see you all next week.